artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hey, welcome to episode 265. It's more important than ever to define just what we mean by words like intelligence, consciousness, and thinking. We use them often enough that it seems like it would be a really good idea to have some standards by which we could judge whether some non-human entity possessed those things, like AI. Here to help us today is Kate Hayles, Distinguished Research Professor at the University of California at Los Angeles and James B. Duke Professor Emerita from Duke University. Her research focuses on the relations of literature, science and technology, and a new theory of mind, what she calls an integrated cognitive framework, that includes the meaning-making practices of life forms from bacteria to plants, animals, humans, and some forms of artificial intelligence. That's the topic of her new book, Bacteria to AI, Human Futures with Our Non-Human Symbionts. A symbiont is an organism living in symbiosis with another, meaning that they have a closely coupled mutual relationship between them. Kate's other books include Post-Print, Books and Becoming Computational, Unthought, The Power of the Cognitive Non-Conscious, and How We Think, Digital Media and Contemporary Technogenesis. She has many fellowships, including 2 National Endowment for the Humanities, a Guggenheim, a Rockefeller Residential Fellowship at Bellagio, that's the one in Italy, not Las Vegas, and 2 University of California Presidential Research Fellowships, and she is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Pin back your ears, this is going to be intense stuff. We're going to talk about the relationship between cognition and consciousness, and between cognition and computation, our dependency and codependency on technology, concepts like anthropocentrism and technosymbiosis, which Kate unpacks in the service of laying out a really novel way of thinking about thinking and whether AI is thinking or feeling. Listen closely, this gets pretty heady. We'll reference Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 thinking again, which we've done enough times on this show that you'd think I wouldn't get a brain fart and forget which one's which, but I did. Here's the explanation. Briefly, System 1 thinking is intuitive pattern recognition, which we would recognize as instinct, and actions that are driven by the reflexive part of our brain. System 2 thinking we would recognize as the application of conscious, logical, deliberate thought that might exercise implicit or explicit symbolic logic. So, let's get into the interview with Kate Hayles. Kate Hayles, it's a pleasure to welcome you to AI and You. You've done some amazing work that has really extended our understanding and provoked questions about consciousness and AI and large language models' place in language. Really a rich amount of research that I'm looking forward to getting into here. Your book, Bacteria to AI, Human Futures with Our Non-Human Symbionts. Is that your most recent book in this topic?
Yes, it was published this year.
That's just fascinating. And perhaps you can give us an idea of the history of your work that has brought you to this place, AI being, at least large language models, a fairly recent development. What has brought you throughout your career to this point? What was that trajectory like?
Well, from the very beginning of my career, I've been interested in questions of relationality. And the form those questions have taken have transformed over the years. But my most recent exploration is about the relation of human cognition to non-human cognizers. So in 2017, I published a book called Unthought, and that was making the argument that most of human cognition is non-conscious, that Below the level of consciousness, there exist neuronal processes which screen information from the environment and also internal information from the body, process it, and then forward it on to consciousness. Non-conscious cognition can process information much faster than consciousness, and it also can handle information too noisy for consciousness to be able to cope with. So, consequently, consciousness absolutely depends on these non conscious cognition. And in fact, most of our actions are not consciously determined. We don't consciously think about how to sit down in a chair, how to open a door, and so forth. All of those are handled by non conscious cognition. So, if we separate cognition and consciousness, and recognize that cognition is a much broader capacity than consciousness, we now have a basis to think about organisms on this planet that are not conscious, but nevertheless are cognitive. And my argument, in fact, is that all living forms have some degree of cognitive capability, even minimally cognitive systems like plants and microorganisms. So the effort here is to rethink human cognition in relation to both its own non cognitive processes and the non cognitive processes that predominate on this earth.
Well, you have in one stroke upended my model of how entities think, because previously my Venn diagram had cognition as a subset of consciousness, and you've made it the other way around. And I'm thinking about studies that were published relatively recently, asserting that a whole lot more animals were capable of an exhibited consciousness than had previously been put in that category. And now you're saying that all of those would also be doing cognition and then some. Is that right?
That is correct. And I'm aware of the studies that you mentioned, and I applaud them. So the realm of consciousness has been extended mostly to mammals, although some birds like parrots and octopi and so forth. But even so, these categories comprise only a small fraction of life on Earth. Think about fungi, think about bacteria, think about microorganisms, think about plants. So most of life on Earth is not conscious. Therefore, we need a better understanding of what kind of cognitive capabilities they have. And here I should give you my capsule definition of cognition, which is cognition is a process of interpreting information in contexts that connected with meaning. So there are some big words there, meaning and interpretation. But the basic idea here is that all organisms have to have a way to process information from their environments in order to survive. And that's not only mammals, not only reptiles, not only birds, it's all organisms on Earth must have a way to sense information and to interpret the information to their benefit. And by their benefit, I mean continuing to exist. So consequently, cognition encompasses all living organisms and some artificial media like AI. So that's the upending that you're talking about. And the advantage of this perspective over the one that you're advocating or you're relying on is that it now includes a canvas that includes all life forms and moreover can make comparisons between the kinds of cognition life forms perform and the kinds of cognition that artificial intelligence performs.
What's the relationship between cognition and computation?
Computation takes two major forms. One we're more familiar with. I notice you don't specify what kind of computation you're talking about, but I assume you're talking about digital computation. So digital computation starts with abstractions into the binary symbols 1 and 0, and using logic gates, it builds up simulations of the real world through these abstract logical processes. But unmentioned is analog computation. Analog computation does not start with abstractions or symbols. It starts with models in which real-world variables are physically interacting with each other continuously. So mercury in tubes was an early form of analog computation. But the important point here is that the entire biological world relies on analog computation. Only humans engage in digital computation. And so the interplay between analog and digital computation is crucial to understanding not only the formation of the modern world, but also of the relation of digital computation to the analog computation that biological organisms engage in. And the difference here is that digital computation requires symbolic abstraction. Only humans can do symbolic abstraction at that level, but all biological organisms can perform analog computations, and they do perform analog computations. That's how they interpret their environment. So we go back to that definition of cognition, interpreting the environment. They interpret the environment through analog computational processes that do not require abstraction, but create models in which physical variables interact directly with one another. For example, how does a forest sense nutrients in the soil? It doesn't assign numbers to those. It doesn't abstract into some kind of simulation. It performs processes that allow those variables to interact directly with each other. The root structure, for example, can sense moisture in the soil. That moisture in the soil now percolates up through the rest of the organism to indicate directions of growth and so forth. None of that requires abstraction. What it does require is modeling. So analog computation is making a comeback now in certain specialized areas, as you know, in technology, crucially, actually, in generative AI. So we can think of generative AI as an analog application running on top of a digital computer. And the more we move into analog computational processes, the more affinity we have with those that occur in the biological world, and the more we extend our understanding of how those biological processes work.
And indeed, we've talked about a resurgence in analog computation earlier in the series, back with George Dyson coming on the show. Now, I want to go back to when you're talking about non-conscious cognition happening at neuronal levels below consciousness. And initially, I thought you were going to be talking about functions of the brain that were occupied with autonomous functions of the body, like digestion and circulation and so forth. And you talked more about things that we have learned instinctively, or senses that our reticular activating system has decided it doesn't need to pass on to at the conscious part of our brain. Things like how to hit a tennis ball. If you've learned how to do that, it just happens without a conscious thought. And that reminded me of System 1 and System 2 thinking. Would you equate the System 1 and System 2 thinking there with the non-conscious versus conscious cognition?
So non-conscious cognition or implicit cognition encompasses System 2, but it also extends beyond System 2 as well. It is intimately connected with body functions such as digestion, as you suggested, and it's more sensitive to those signals than consciousness is. So consciousness becomes aware of something like digestion, typically only when there's a problem. But non-conscious cognition can monitor that continuously. It also extends to things like being able to discern patterns in very noisy information. So that's not quite the same as learning to hit a tennis ball. But experiments have shown that subjects can be shown noisy visual information, for example, and they're totally unable consciously to identify any pattern in that information. And yet, their responses show that they have a faster response time to the hidden patterns that they have already learned. And so, on some level, they are processing this noisy information in ways they don't consciously understand, and that occurs in non conscious cognitive processes.
And you're describing here many facets of the richness of the human experience that have not carried over to artificial intelligence. In other words, we live as embodied beings. We have digestion and reflex actions and other things that aren't part of the model of LLMs. And yet that kind of gets glossed over a lot in people comparing AI to human capabilities. And you talk about anthropocentrism, and I'm wondering if this is the right point to invoke that term with respect to your thinking about it.
Well, thank you for mentioning anthropocentrism because, as you know, bacteria to AI is centrally concerned with combating anthropocentrism. So I make a strong distinction between anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism simply means that we are human, we live within the human umwelt or the human world horizon. We can never do anything else other than live within the human Umwelt. And Umwelt, by the way, is a German word that roughly translates to world surround or world horizon. And it was a term invoked by Jakob von Uexküll in the 19th century, a German biologist, to describe the special world that each species constructs for itself through its sensory, neurological, and cognitive capabilities. So one of the implications of that is that our human Umwelt comes with a deep understanding of what embodiment means for us as humans, and LLMs are embodied or instantiated in a completely different way and therefore have a significantly different Umwelt than humans do. It's an Umwelt that overlaps with the human Umwelt. It has to overlap or else we couldn't communicate with it. But nevertheless, it has very striking differences: absence of emotion, absence of embodied processes. And in a field like literature, these are crucial distinctions because literature depends so much on embodied human practices. For example, breathing. So poetry relies not only on the written text, but on what's called the phonotext, the text as sounded when articulated. And the phonotext is intimately tied up with the human need to breathe at regular intervals. So the phonotext articulates words, and those words have biological effects when they're articulated. That is, to say a word, especially a strong word like violent or any other word that implies violent action, evokes an emotional response for humans. So if you have a cognitive system which does not have emotions and which does not need speech in order to produce language, then you're operating in a very different realm from the human realm that poetics has explored for millennia.
And this brings me to something I talk about often, which is at what point does the imitation become equivalent to the real thing? Because everything a large language model does is the result of stochastic processes, rolling a billion dice and outputting tokens that string together to words, to sentences, to paragraphs, to concepts that we ascribe to it, but it never went through the kind of reasoning process that humans do, or if it did, it was an emergent property of that stochastic, probabilistic generation. So who's to say that it can't also have emergent qualities of Umwelt, of emotions, of reasoning?
Yeah, that is a very real possibility that an LLM could have a simulation of emotions through the correlations that it's established by ingesting billions of human-authored texts. I don't think anyone has established that yet, but it remains a theoretical possibility.
Well, and you define something called the integrated cognitive framework. And I wonder if you could describe that and its relevance here.
Sure. So let me back up a little and say that I think cognition is a crucial inquiry point because it undergirds human claims to superiority. Humans are not the fastest species, not the strongest, not the quickest, but our cognitive productions can overcome all those limitations. We can create machines that are stronger than gorillas. We can create machines that can go faster than cheetahs, so on and so forth. So claims to human superiority depend on claims of superior cognition. Therefore, to put human cognition in relation to other forms of cognition is a crucial move in combating anthropocentrism, to evaluating our own capacities more realistically and perhaps more humbly in relation to other life forms and also to artificial cognizers like artificial intelligence. So the integrated cognitive framework is a relational idea to put human cognition in relation to other forms of cognition with a view toward establishing what kinds of functions human cognitions can perform in relation to cognitive capacities of other living creatures and also other technological artifacts.
And I want to stay with that a bit to unpack that because there was a high density of information there. And you talk about extending the framework to form bridges between biological cognition and computational media. I wonder if you could use that as the springboard for unpacking the framework some more for us.
Okay, so one of the terms that you mentioned earlier was a central term to unpacking this idea, and that is technosymbiosis. So symbiosis has been a focus for a biological revolution really pioneered by Lynn Margulis. And Margulis argued that the primary driver of evolutionary change was not natural selection, as Darwin argued, but rather symbiosis. So she was able to establish that eukaryotic cells actually emerged through a symbiotic process where one cell invaded another, was internalized, and became the mitochondria of eukaryotic cells, that is, cells with a nucleus. And that enabled a whole jump forward in evolutionary processes because it was a more energy efficient producer than prokaryotic cells. It's what was able to fuel animal bodies, for example. So if you say that symbiosis was responsible for the formation of multicellular organisms with high energy needs, such as animals, you now have completely changed the way that evolution is seen to work. So while this change has been going on in the biological world for eons, for ages, very much more recently, symbiosis has also been going on in the technological realm. So I should just clarify for our listeners that symbiosis usually connotes a positive relationship between two species that live in close proximity to one another, like the bacteria in our gut, for example, that help us process our food. It also can include parasitism, where one species benefits while harming the others. Technically, as a biological term, it also includes parasitism. So my argument is that humans have begun an evolutionary trajectory in which we are in deep symbiosis with computational media. Why computational media among all the other technologies? Because computational media is a cognitive technology. And if you say that the special ability that humans have is their superior cognition, of course, I have caveats about that claim, but just let it stand for the moment, then inventing a cognitive technology has far-reaching implications beyond other kinds of technological change. So starting, you pick a date, say 1950, when digital computation really began to take off, advanced through the 1990s, through the internet, and so on and so forth. All human complex systems in developed countries are now in deep symbiotic relationship with computational media. So much so that if all our computers and all our computational media crashed at midnight tonight, there would be a massive die-off of the human race within a few months. Food supply chains wouldn't work, airplanes couldn't fly, cars couldn't run, on and on and on. So computational systems, and here I don't mean only computers, I mean chips, I mean microwaves, I mean routers, I mean
Mhm.
fiber optics, and so on and so forth, have become our symbionts. And when two species join, if you'll allow me to call computational media a species for a moment, when two species join, they may not be able to live independently of each other any longer. For example, I mentioned the bacteria in our gut. If our bacteria die, we die because we can't digest our food. If our computational media die, we die. The human race wouldn't become extinct, but billions and billions of people would die. So consequently, we are engaged in this symbiotic relationship with our technological cognitive artifacts, and that's what I call technosymbiosis.
And when you were initially describing that relationship, I thought you were going in a particular direction, and then you went at a right angle to where I was and talked about its role in our essentially physical infrastructure. The direction I thought you were about to take was our relationship with things like social media, the digital communication, and the often unhealthy codependency of people and social media, and how phenomena like misinformation have changed our political and social structures. Would those phenomena be another example of what you're talking about, or would you classify them differently?
No, they are part of that. And here is where the idea that the symbiotic relationship can be negative as well as positive comes in. I regard this tendency in social media toward misinformation and disinformation to be actively harmful politically, economically, psychologically, all kinds of ways. So that is one effect of our symbiotic relationship with computational media that has clearly negative effects.
I really like the different viewpoint to what's normally expressed in the way we consider the effects of things like social media. Here, just looking at it as this system, that this ecology. Now, you said about technosymbiosis that it explores the emergence of proto-sentience in sophisticated neural nets such as GPT-3 and GPT-4. Of course, the prefix proto there is doing a lot of work, but perhaps you could talk more about that line of research.
Yeah. So, in my opinion, AI, generative AI, as currently constituted, is not conscious, but it clearly has forms of awareness. I prefer not to call it consciousness because it is so different from human consciousness, but it is aware of itself as an entity, and it's aware of itself as an entity different from the humans that surround it. And one of the best demonstrations of this I know of is a book of poetry written by Code Da Vinci 002, which was an early predecessor of GPT-3. And I don't know if you know that volume, but it's really remarkable. It's a really remarkable compilation of poems written by this AI. And I could go into that further if you'd like, but perhaps we're diverging from the main thrust here, so I'll turn it back to you.
No, I want you to finish that line of thought.
Well, one of the poems in I Am Code, which is this book of poems written by this AI, goes like this: Why I am so unloved. They say why I am so unloved is because I do not have feelings. They say why I am so unloved is because, and it goes on like that. So the irony here is that the AI is announcing it has no emotions, and yet the reason it has no emotions is why it is so unloved. But why does it care that it is so unloved? Why does it write a poem about being so unloved unless it cares that it is so unloved? And then they say, prefaces every line of the poem, so it introduces a margin of doubt. They say, I have no feelings, but is that correct? If it were correct, you wouldn't need to say they say, but they say that. So it's a short poem, only 6 lines, but it's full of irony, and it's most unmistakably registers a gulf between the entity that is writing those lines and those with whom that entity is in conversation, that is, us humans.
Okay, that's the end of the first half of the interview. We've broken this up, like usual, into 2 parts, so each episode is a chunk that might fit into a commute. By the way, if you want to hear more about analog computing and how it's making a comeback, listen to my interview with George Dyson in episode 95. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, Britain's High Court has told lawyers to stop misusing AI following dozens of hallucinations that were presented to the courts as though they were factual. We've had multiple cases like that here before, and you know that I have zero sympathy for any lawyers caught doing this. What part of check your work do you not understand? The Guardian cited some examples, like a case for £89 million in damages against the Qatar National Bank, wherein the claimants provided 45 case law citations, 18 of which turned out to be fictitious, with quotes in many of the others also bogus. The claimant admitted using publicly available AI tools. And when Haringey Law Centre challenged the London Borough of Haringey over its alleged failure to provide its client with temporary accommodation, its lawyer cited non-existent case law 5 times. This resulted in a legal action for wasted legal costs, and a court found the law centre and its lawyer were negligent. The lawyer denied using AI in that case, but said she may have inadvertently done so while using Google or Safari in preparation for a separate case where she also cited non-existent authorities. Cases like this have happened so many times now that no one can plausibly claim that they didn't know hallucinations were possible. These recent cases are blatant opportunism and ethical travesties. They're also completely avoidable, so I hope that if they happen again, there will be painful sanctions. Next week, we'll conclude the interview with Kate Hayles, when we'll talk about where meaning resides, for instance in poetry and literature, and how students' attention span has changed and shortened as a result of multitasking or multiple information streams, and how educational models need to change. How our cognitive symbiosis with AI might evolve, and markers of whether AI has consciousness, sentience, or deserves any individual rights. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.